When my brother Gareth was 18, he died in a tragic boating accident, and my life changed forever. He was a competitive rower, and his 8-man crew were out training one winter's evening on a suburban lake in Canada when a massive storm blew in out of the North Pacific. Within minutes, there were 6-foot waves, and the boys' rowing shell was smashed in two. The crew were immersed in the 2-degree cold water, and for a while, they held hands over the upturned hull, and they called out their seat numbers to stay in contact. But within 20 minutes, the cold was dangerously deep in their bones, and my brother, a lean, super fit young man, slipped off the hull and drifted like an autumn leaf down to the lake floor. Out of that trauma, I spiraled into years of drugs and booze and failed relationships. It was a time of disconnection, a time of withdrawal from family and friends and so much that had given me joy. But at the bottom of that dark well, a memory came back to me. And it was a dream associated with the Saturday morning walks that I'd make with my mom and my brothers and my sister. And I think just about everybody out there has had those family walks, those little journeys of discovery, communication, creativity, and love. Our Saturday morning walks brought us to the local library in Belfast, and there I'd choose my books for the week. Usually I'd get a couple of kids' mysteries, Hardy Boys, Enid Blyton, but then I would gravitate towards the mountaineering section. And mountaineers in those days were like rock stars. Every year they were bringing out books, and all of those books had these beautiful full-color photo inserts. And I would sit in a nook in the library and immerse myself in those images of men and women in brightly colored puffer jackets leaning into precipitously steep slopes, a sea of summits stretching out behind them and titanium white snow all around. And at the bottom of my dark well, that dream came back to me. And so I saved up my money, I jumped on a plane to Delhi, and from there it was trains, buses, and jeeps over the Himalayas to Ladakh. Now Ladakh is an area that's bounded by Pakistan, Tibet, and India. It's a high-altitude desert where 6,000-meter peaks and fluorescent green fields of barley cradle the mighty Indus River. For me, it was love at first sight. And one trekking season led to 2, then 3, and eventually I was 8 years in those magnificent mountains. And the highlight of that time was a very long walk, a 2,700-kilometer solo traverse from Pakistan across northern India and on to Nepal. It was really a time of magic. It was something, I'd started it merely wanting to be the first person to complete the route. But as the trek wore on, so many things happened. Every day I was moving through breathtaking scenery. Every day I was interacting with wild and amazing people, monks, nuns, sadhus, soldiers, and shepherds. And at the end of that, I wanted to write a book. And so I stayed on in the town of Dharamsala. That is the home in exile of the Dalai Lama. And there I put pen to paper. And after a couple of months, I had what I thought was a book. And being Irish, I celebrated that moment pretty heavily. And then a couple of days later, I came back to start the editing process. But very quickly, what I realized was that what I'd written was a pile of junk. Nobody was going to read this, and nobody was going to publish it. And for me, as a storyteller, there was a deep, deep sense of frustration around that. And so that led to over 10 years of writing and rewriting, researching and rejigging, until eventually I was in Kathmandu a decade later. And an editor friend there volunteered to read the manuscript and give me some feedback. So I handed over the book. A week later, we got together for dinner. She came armed with 10 pages of notes, and I will not lie, it was critically a very difficult evening for me. But at the bottom of her analysis, what she was saying was, she thought there was something else going on. She thought there was a story within the story that I hadn't even tapped into. Now, I was sitting there politely nodding my head, but in the back of my mind, I was saying, she doesn't understand. This is my book about my trek through my Himalayas. So much for all of that selfless Buddhist meditation I'd been doing. Anyway, a couple of days later, I was sitting in my hotel room in Kathmandu, and I was editing the section of the book again where I reached the source of the Ganges. Now that was an incredible day. Bright, crisp, cool, clear. Gangotri, where that trek starts, is a high alpine village bookmarked north and south by ice-shrouded peaks. And the trek from Gangotri up to Gaumuk Glacier, the source of the river, is one of the most sacred in Hinduism. Every year, tens of thousands of devotees make that trek to the source of what hundreds of millions of Hindus believe to be the Mother Goddess. Now, I was making that trek at the start of winter, so I was the only person moving up this high valley. And as the afternoon wore on and the light began to change, I caught a glimpse of the face of the glacier, and I so wanted to be there before darkness that I threw off my backpack and I started running up the glacial moraine, leaping from boulder to boulder until I reached the turquoise ice cave from where the river emanates. And I so wanted to appreciate that place that I just sat down on the gray sand beach at the mouth of the cave. I was exhausted. I had walked for thousands of kilometers. I'd crossed multiple religions and cultures to get there. And as I was sitting, I felt a heat rise up my spine, a tingle that moved from vertebrae to vertebrae until it reached my skull. And there that heat transformed to tears. And I found myself crying at the birthplace of the Mother Goddess. Now, I'd always attributed that welling up of emotion to being at that incredible piece of sacred geography. But years later, sitting in that hotel room in Kathmandu, editing that section of the book again, I had an overwhelming sense of déjà vu. I'd been there before. It was something about the light, the temperature, the humidity. And I realized the last time I'd had that same confluence of feelings was when I'd seen my brother's body dead in a hospital morgue in Canada. And that was it. The lights went on, the rainbows exploded because I realized that was the key. I had to ask myself, because then I knew, why had I walked alone 2,700 kilometers across the Himalayas? And why had I spent 10 years trying to make sense of that? Of course, it was all about the universal suffering every one of us will have to face in this life, the coming to terms with the death of a loved one. That was the key. That was the magic key. And with that, I rewrote the book again. And this time it was amazing how many of the most memorable moments on the walk had resonance back to time that I had spent with Gareth. And in that feverish reconsideration, I also saw that the person that I had changed over those thousands of kilometers of walking. And I saw that the vehicle for that transformation was my feet. Walking had brought me to those incredible mountains, but walking for 30 to 40 kilometers a day had generated some kind of a meditative state that had enabled me to reframe my grief and to reconnect with so much that I'd lost. For me, someone who's always been a walker, a trekker, a runner, a bipedal adventurer, this was something worth investigating. And so I began to research. And what I discovered blew me away. We've been walking for 4 million years. And when you've been doing something for that long, it changes you. Think about our bodies, our external being. We are completely evolved to walk. 2 strong legs, long straight spine, curved feet that absorb and project energy in every step. And internally, too, we are adapted to walking. Think about our incredible sense of balance, our ability to adjust on the fly. And even more subtly, have you ever noticed how when you're walking, the way that you think changes? Have you ever been on a walk where your mood wasn't better at the end of it than it was at the beginning? To me, this was incredible because we always talk about how walking 10,000 steps is great for our health. But nobody talks about how walking is great for the way that we think. For me, after 7 years of research, a PhD, a best-selling book, I know for a fact that walking is intrinsic to the way that we think. Walking is two-footed magic. Walking is our creative superpower. So what's going on? Well, I think we have to start with why. Why has walking developed as this catalyst for great thought? And I believe that the reason for that is because we have been hunters and gatherers for over 2.5 million years. And what that means is that our survival, our entire species survival, is dependent upon movement. Now us, humans, Homo sapiens, we only really have one great physiological advantage over all other species. We can't outmuscle a bear and we can't outsprint a cheetah. What we do well is heat dissipation. Now what that means is that over hours, sometimes days, we can outwalk just about any other species. And so our ancestors developed long-range hunting techniques. So what makes a great hunter? Well, of course, they have to be superbly adapted to walking and running over great distances, but it's the psychological makeup of a great hunter that interests me, because a productive hunter has to be a predictive thinker. They have to be able to visualize where their prey is going to be in 10 minutes or 30 minutes. And to do that, they have to completely imagine. They have to become that kangaroo or that antelope. Now, what I've just described there in very simple terms are some of the key ingredients to effective creative thinking. Visualizing a goal, imagining a pathway to achieve that goal, and having the empathy to undertake a new way. Now, these types of skills didn't develop overnight. We're talking evolutionary timescales. We're talking millions of years of survival-dependent long-range hunting instilling in us this capacity to imagine and achieve anything. So how has thousands of millennia of focused walking adapted the mechanisms of the brain to this bipedal creative thinking? Well, I can break that down into 3 areas: chemical, electrical, and activity alterations in the brain. So, after we've been walking for a few minutes, the flow of neurotransmitters into the brain starts to change. We see increases in dopamine, serotonin, anandamide, and norepinephrine. And lots of you will know that these are some of the key ingredients in the pharmaceuticals used to treat depression and anxiety. So almost immediately after we start walking, we begin to relax. After a few more minutes, we see changes in the brain's neuroelectrical activity. We move from the beta range to the theta. That's the area that we're working in when we're meditating. So again, we're loosening up. We're relaxing. But it's after 30 to 45 minutes of walking that the real magic starts to kick in. And that's because the prefrontal cortex, which is the part of the brain associated with executive functions, but also with our creation of a sense of self, its activity starts to slow down too. Now, when prefrontal cortex activity decelerates, we start to lose the structures that define us. We start kicking out the doors of who we think we are. We start losing those old ways of thinking. And this is really important from a creative sense because to be truly creative, we have to be completely open. We have to be open to new ideas, new ways of seeing, new understandings of ourselves and the world. And it's this accessibility to the new that leads to the breakdown of the rumination that develops after traumatic events. And so this is the real reason why a very long walk in the Himalayas helped me come to terms with the death of my little brother. And this is why walking and especially multi-day hikes have proved so successful for veterans suffering from PTSD. And it's this accessibility to the new that has led people from Aristotle to Darwin to Virginia Woolf to Gandhi to Marina Abramovich to Steve Jobs and my mom, all talking about how they've had their best ideas when they've been out for a walk. So try and keep all this in mind the next time you're lacing up your shoes and heading out the door. Walking is much, much more than 10,000 steps. It's a catalyst for us to generate great ideas. It's a medium through which we can understand ourselves better. And it's a framework through which we can be better people. Thank you very much.